Viewers of VisualPolitik, I have a very important announcement to make. Donald Trump, he's back. Yes, that's right, Trump is back in the news. And why, you may ask? Well, because of this.
Trump sues Twitter, Google and Facebook alleging censorship, 7th of July 2021.
As you know, after the storming of the Capitol, all the major internet platforms suspended all of Donald Trump's accounts. Why? Well, because Trump was agitating his followers hours before they stormed the Capitol. In other words, they didn't accuse him of organising the assault, but they did blame him for creating the climate of hatred that provoked the attack. And this opens a very serious debate. To what extent are we talking about censorship? And I know what many of you are thinking. They are private companies. Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube can make any rules they want. And yes, you're right. The problem is that these three platforms have the oligopoly of online content. That is, if YouTube takes down a channel, it is very difficult, almost impossible for that channel to find another similar platform from which to broadcast online. But wait a minute, because we're not just talking about a whim of the big tech companies. In reality, Twitter, Facebook, and Google are stuck between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, Trump and many others are denouncing them for violating freedom of speech. But on the other hand, many governments are pressuring them to remove all of what is considered harmful content. Listen up.
Facebook and YouTube face tough new laws on extremist and explicit videos. Europe proposes new rules and fines to force social media firms to tackle online video, 24th of May 2017.
To give you an idea, some of these laws include fines of up to 50 million euros. The question is, are we really talking about censorship? And how reasonable is it to demand that YouTube protect us from harmful content? Today, we're going to answer these questions, but first, let's take a look at some history.
How much freedom of speech is too much?
In November 2015, a Spanish girl was arrested at Barajas Airport in Madrid as she was about to travel to Turkey to join Daesh. The most incredible thing about this story is that the girl in question was not even born into a Muslim family. This girl was radicalized by watching Daesh propaganda on social media. There was a time, not so many years ago, when it was absurdly easy to find radical Islamist propaganda videos. They were even on Instagram. Of course, in almost all democratic countries, there are laws prohibiting terrorist propaganda. That is, even if the constitution of any European country recognizes freedom of speech, there are some limits. An explicit call to violence is one of them. The problem that no matter how many laws there are, it is very difficult to prevent someone from creating a terrorist propaganda video and making it go viral. It's the other side of the freedom that the internet gives us. Back then, only one platform had the algorithms to detect Daesh videos in time. And yes, that platform was YouTube. Why? That's a topic for another video. But the truth is that Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter had not bothered to prevent extreme groups such as Daesh and many others from running wild. And that's what set the alarm bells off in many governments. Think about it. No matter how much the police pursued the terrorists, every day, new followers of Daesh were emerging who had been radicalized on the internet. And that's what prompted several countries in Europe to come up with their own laws to hold Facebook and Twitter responsible for the content they had. The first, and the most significant, was Germany. Think about it. Since the 1950s, Germany has had very strict laws to prevent neo-Nazi speech. Denying the Holocaust can be punishable by years in prison. And in some cases, these laws have led to absurd situations like this one.
Wolfenstein removed from sale in Germany due to Nazi symbols, 22nd of September 2009.
By the way, as of 2019, Germany has relaxed these laws, and now, at last, Wolfenstein is legal again in Germany. Happy shooting. The truth is that Germany has always had quite a few restrictions to prevent extremist speech. So, in 2017, they decided to pioneer one more restriction. Yes, we're talking about the so-called NetzDG law. Yes, that's how everyone knows this law. According to this law, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter are obliged to remove harmful content within 24 hours of being notified by the authorities. If they fail to do so, they may have to pay fines of up to 50 million euros. The problem is that what may have initially been a law to prevent terrorist propaganda ended up turning into something much worse.
Non più tra i farfalloni amorosi.
Weeks after the law was passed, both Twitter and Facebook removed the account of a member of the Alternative for Germany party for posting anti-immigrant messages. But then days later, Twitter also deleted the account of the satirical magazine that had mentioned this politician in order to make fun of her. And a few days later, Twitter also closed the account of a comedian who made another joke about Alternative for Germany. Conclusion: if you have Twitter in Germany, it's best just not to talk about immigrants, neither for or against. And don't think that we're talking about just a couple of extreme cases. To give you an idea, in the first 6 months of 2019 alone, YouTube had to delete more than 280 videos. And let's face it, YouTube is the only company that has made its actions public. But we'll talk about the differences between Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube when it comes to moderating content in another video coming soon. If you don't want to miss it, then subscribe to this channel and hit that little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. What is certain is that this German law has created a benchmark. In 2020, France passed another law to combat hate speech. The difference is that, in this case, the Constitutional Court managed to overturn it. And this is where the other big problem with legislation that wants to regulate fake news, disinformation, and hate speech comes in. Most democratic countries have constitutions that recognize freedom of expression. Of course, all of them recognize certain exceptions, such as the right to honor. But in this case, we are talking about something much deeper. We are talking about being able to censor content on the grounds that are difficult to define. However, within the European Union, there are more and more voices calling for real policies to curb harmful content. At the time of making this video, the Digital Services Act, which makes platforms responsible for the content they have, is being processed, but the debate is still open. Many politicians are afraid that this law will serve to silence certain political positions, such as Euroscepticism or anti-immigration speech, and online platforms cannot be held responsible for the thousands of hours of content they host. Not to mention how difficult it would be to fit this law into the constitutions of many member states. There is still no political consensus on this issue. And that is why, in spring 2021, the European Parliament has published the study on the liability of online platforms. That's right, the doctrine is clear. Online platforms are responsible for the content they display. Not only should they act when there is a copyright violation, but also when there is a violation of public decency or morality. So this study proposes 4 different scenarios. A, do nothing. B, create media education campaigns among the population. C, public-private regulation, and D,
self-regulation.
That's right, at the moment, the most common scenario in Europe is for the platforms themselves to self-regulate. That is to say that they create a set of rules and take care of deleting all the malicious content that may have crept in. So where's the problem then? Well, we're going to look at that right now.
The origins of Happily Ever After.
What if I told you that the Hollywood happy ending was born as a response to censorship? Yes, indeed. The happy ending was born at a time when movies weren't allowed to end badly. Not at least if they wanted to receive the seal of approval to be shown in cinemas. I'll give you an example. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is a Frank Capra film. This movie tells the story of an idealistic politician who has to take on all the corrupt senators in Washington. In theory, it doesn't appear to have any objectionable subject matter, right? Remember that this movie is from 1939. Criticizing the workings of the US system could be seen as communist propaganda. At the time, movies had to convey moral values. That meant that the bad guys had to be punished, the good guys had to win, and the moral of the story had to be, well, moral. And I know what many of you are thinking. How is that possible? If there's one thing the United States is known for, it's freedom of speech. It is very clear in the First Amendment of the Constitution. And yes, you're right. The problem is when you consider that cinema is not a means of expression. I know, you'll think I've gone crazy, but that's exactly what happened. Don't forget one thing, we are talking about the beginning of the 20th century. Back then, cinema was a new technology, just like internet content platforms are now. And that was precisely the judicial doctrine handed down by the US Supreme Court in 1915. Watch for the final verdict.
The exhibition of moving pictures is a business, pure and simple, and not to be regarded as part of the press of the country or as organs of public opinion within the meaning of freedom of speech. Mutual Film Corporation versus Industrial Commission of Ohio, 1915.
Yes, that's right. Cinema wasn't considered a medium of expression. But wait a minute, because the story doesn't end here. Have you heard of the Me Too movement? Well, it's not new either. The Harvey Weinstein of 1920 was a comedy actor, Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle. The fatty scandal was the perfect lurid story. Sex, murder, and Hollywood stars. A perfect cocktail to sell newspapers. And you'll never guess who was the media mogul who made the most out of this story? Exactly, William Randolph Hearst. At the time, he already had several newspapers across the country. From one day to the next, Hollywood sex scandals became the talk of every bar and barbershop in America. The whole country was scandalized by the stars' lack of morals. And in the midst of this moral panic, the states decided to start legislating. Since movies were no longer considered a medium of communication, the various states in the US were able to pass all sorts of censorship laws. By 1921, there were already 37 states with censorship, and that's when Hollywood decided to act. So, the Motion Picture Association of America created a code of best practices. But how do you create a code of good moral practices? Well, that's easy. Who were the greatest experts in public morality at the time? Well, obviously, the priests. That's how Hollywood came to hire this man you see on screen. William Harrison Hayes, a Presbyterian priest. And don't think they spared any expense. Mr. Hayes came to earn a salary of $100,000 a year at the time. In today's dollars, we're talking about $1.5 million a year. In addition, this man hired a team of priests to help him create the code. A code that took years to finish and has since become known as the Hayes Code, a censorship code with rules as detailed as this one.
Ministers of religion in their characters as such should not be used as comic characters or as villains. Extract from the Motion Pictures Production Code.
From 1934, all films had to pass through a court of priests to be given the moral seal of approval. And pay attention to one detail. We're talking about something much worse than censorship. Hollywood censorship was not limited to eliminating a specific scene or prohibiting this or that. As this was something accepted by the production companies themselves, censorship affected the whole story. For example, have you seen The Maltese Falcon? If you read the book it's based on, you'll see that there's an openly homosexual character. Remember that literature was considered a medium of communication, so novels did enjoy freedom of expression. However, in the movie, that same character could be neither openly homosexual nor good, so he ended up being a simply effeminate gentleman, and of course, the bad guy in the movie. From the 1930s to the 1960s, you can find hundreds of examples like this. Luckily, in the 1960s, the Supreme Court changed its doctrine. Today, movies in the United States enjoy the same freedom of expression as any other media. However, it seems that the same story is repeating itself with another new technology.
European Commission and IT companies announce Code of Conduct on Illegal Online Hate Speech, 31st of May 2016.
That's right, but before you drop your heads in your hands, let me tell you that for a moment, this code is quite broad. That is, for the moment, the only limits set are to avoid propaganda from terrorist groups, clear hate messages that were already banned in most countries. The problem is that this code is from 2016, and we are now in 2021, and Europe is asking for even more restrictions.
Guidance on strengthening the code of practice on disinformation, 26th of May 2021.
The big problem that Europe wants to solve is no longer hate speech, but disinformation. That is, the fake news and conspiracy theories that have grown like wildfire in the age of the coronavirus. The problem is, who says what is true and what is not? Can this really be judged without being free of bias? And how can internet platforms regulate themselves? That's what we'll talk about in an upcoming video here on VisualPolitik. And we'll take a closer look at the differences between these three characters. The CEO of YouTube, the CEO of Facebook, and the CEO of Twitter. But in the meantime, you can leave me your opinion in the comments. How do you think fake news can be filtered on the internet? Should we really do it? You can leave me your answers in those comments. In the meantime, don't forget that here on VisualPolitik, we release new videos every week. So subscribe to this channel and hit the little bell icon so you don't miss any of our updates. And if you like the video, then give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next one. Regards, see you soon.